Hello, you beautiful engineers. Has this ever happened to you? You've built your own automotive company from the ground up, with nothing but a small loan of $1 million. In the booming post-war economy, you're on track to making billions, and your cars are getting bigger and better. Well, mostly bigger. Then the 70s arrive, and there's a problem. The government is taking all your money. Why? Well, apparently they've decided the smog is your fault. Outrageous. Now you have to start thinking about emissions. So you panic. What's this emission screen? There is a whole lot of nonsense in here. Hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxides? I don't know. Lean it out. Get rid of the cams. Well, you've made an engine that's passing for now, but you've gone and made less horsepower than last year. That's right, your company has fallen into malaise. Now your giant, proud automobiles crawl along at the pace of a bicyclist. Maybe this is fine. Or maybe you're about to be driven out of business by much better competitors. To avoid seeing thousands of your unsold cars sent to the junkyard for scrap, you can watch this video and become an emissions expert, able to make any engine green. Once you know all the tricks, you can have pickup trucks as big as you want, crazy horsepower and family cars, or even get the government to pay you every time you sell a supercar. Much like Toyota, emissions credits can be your source of bonus money. When trying to understand how emissions work in automation, it's best to start with the fuel economy calculation. As you might already know, automation has a pretty detailed driving simulation built into it. This takes into complete account the power that the engine makes at any RPM and throttle position in a power map. Similarly, there's a map across all engine throttle and RPM positions for fuel consumption, power produced, timing, and each of the emissions chemicals. Using similar logic to the test track here, the game simulates a driving cycle to determine the fuel economy. This is based on the real-world, Worldwide Light Vehicles Test Procedure, or WLPT. WLPT has 3 classes based on your car's power and weight, where much slower cars drive a lower class cycle. This basically means that they're driven at lower speeds to determine the fuel economy. Basically, any modern car is going to be in Class 3, but some very low-powered early game cars might be in Class 1 or 2. Because that can cause big differences in the calculated fuel economy, the game assigns a percentage to each one instead of jumping over all at once. Otherwise, you get effects in older versions of the game where you change your gearing just a little bit and it causes a drastic change in fuel economy. It's worth noting that if you're mostly familiar with the United States EPA fuel economy, often cases, this produces a lower fuel economy number than WLPT because it's a little more difficult on the car. That can be why automation cars seem to get a little bit better fuel economy than their real-world counterparts. Actually, it's not because the engine is inaccurately simulated. It's just because it's being held to European standards and not US EPA standards. The game combines airflow, friction, thermal efficiency, and power to ultimately create a fuel efficiency and emissions map. What you're seeing here is a consequence of the speed chart from the WLPT test combined with your car's power, drag, and gearing. For every instant in the test, the car is in a certain gear, at a certain RPM in a certain throttle position. That creates the highlighted areas on this map of throttle and RPM. The dark areas are spots where there is little or no time used in the calculation. The light spots have some time spent in the calculation, and the red spots have a lot of time spent at that position on the map in the calculation. If you were to change something such as the engine size, you'd see all those dots move around, as well as the colors for fuel efficiency change. That's because it's now being kept at a higher throttle for the smaller engine. A lot of these dots move upwards. Some areas become more or less fuel efficient, so the colors change. If you were to make a change to gearing, you'll see these move generally left and right a lot as well. Going to much longer gearing moves all these dots to the left. We're spending more time at a lower RPM. As a consequence, this vehicle's gained 5 miles per gallon or so. Although it's not necessarily ideal because this is a pickup truck which benefits from lower gearing. For the record, this default vehicle I've started with is actually an AI-generated pickup truck, so it's the same sort of vehicle that you're playing against in the campaign as a competitor. All of these calculations go on to simulate what you'd expect to be common sense effects. Giving the car better aerodynamics, or less drag, means that the throttle is being used at a lower position, which is actually why your fuel economy is better. The same goes for changing up your gearing, or for making the engine smaller, but not too small. There's a point at which making your engine smaller means that you're running it so hard, it would actually be more efficient to have a larger engine turning at a lower RPM with less friction losses. It's also important to understand that emissions are calculated in the same way as fuel, which means they are, of course, affected both by changes in the engine, such as cam profile, compression, fuel systems, fuel economy, quality of all these parts, as well as changes in the car. Gearing, tires, aerodynamics, weight, all of that matters. If I just drag this weight slider all the way to heavy, again, you see throttle climbing higher, and our fuel economy has decreased a little bit. This is the fuel map, which plays a big role both in fuel economy and emissions. In an engine, fuel and air are mixed and combusted. The ideal ratio at which no air is left over or no fuel is left over is 14.7. That's the stoichiometric ratio, and that means that no air or fuel in the cylinder is wasted. Otherwise, you have unburnt fuel or air going out the exhaust. However, in a lot of situations, as explained by this long-winded paragraph, engines will run rich or lean for various reasons. In this case, our car is running lean. If you put less fuel in, we use less fuel. Very simple. If we increase the fuel map to about how it was before, we can see that much more parts of the fuel map are rich. And that enables us to make more power and be more reliable on some occasions. Air-fuel ratio can also be given in lambda, where 1.0 is stoichiometric, or chemically equal amounts of air and fuel. Higher numbers are lean, there's more air, and lower numbers are rich, there's more fuel. Now, that brings us to the tricky part about emissions. Because there are 3 different regulated tailpipe chemicals, hydrocarbons, which are basically just unburnt fuel, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen oxides, making changes to your engine could improve your production of one, but make the production of the other chemicals worse. It's not as simple as just saving fuel, where you can take fuel out and then save fuel. Hydrocarbons are basically unburnt fuel. They're caused by a rich burn and poor combustion. Carbon monoxide is also caused by poor combustion and, again, tends to get worse as fuel is richer. Nitrous oxides are the opposite. They tend to occur worse when the engine is running lean and there's extra air in the engine. A large portion of the air that the engine breathes in is nitrogen, so if there's oxygen left over in the hot combustion chamber, the oxygen and nitrogen can react. In automation, you have to meet emissions targets called the World Emissions Standard. These are fictional, but are not too far off from real-world Euro emission standards. Each level of World Emission Standards has a limit on each kind of chemical, with no regulations on nitrous oxide until level 4, and as you can see in detail, each chemical becomes stricter with each level, with the exception of going from 8 to 9, where slightly more carbon monoxide is allowed to be produced, but nitrous oxide limits become much lower. And of course, all these do have a real unit of milligrams per kilometer traveled. Again, this is based on the driving cycle in your fuel economy test. Now, what can you actually change to improve your emissions? To demonstrate most of the things that you can change on your car and engine to affect emissions, we'll be looking at this, almost the absolute worst case scenario. Let's suppose it's 1975, and you've got a pickup truck which is not brand new with a large V8 engine. This is about the situation you'd find yourself in campaign if you had just ignored emissions until you suddenly realized you weren't making a profit anymore because of it. In this case, we go to the regulations screen and we can see that very soon WES 6 is going to be enacted in Gazmia and Frunia if you're selling cars there. That means that realistically, that's what we need to hit to sell this car without a cash penalty, and then it will be good for basically 10 years or more. We also have a big V8 engine, which is not new. Its family year is 1946. That would be the engine you probably started with in campaign. Now here in the car designer, I can quickly change the family year and you can see the effect of it. I just have to change something for it to refresh. And you can see there, massive difference in all three emissions chemicals, just directly from the family year. That's one of the biggest changes you can make right away, is to make sure that your engine is not getting too old. I'd recommend replacing your engine every 20 to 25 years normally. Once you know that emissions is coming up around 1975 or 1970, maybe 1965 or getting up there, it's time to replace it. That's what I would say is always good advice. But we're going to proceed with the older engine in this worst case scenario where we haven't planned ahead and need a turnaround quickly. The first and most important advice is going to be a switch to unleaded gasoline and get the best catalytic converter you can. In the early 70s, you'll only have access to the two-way catalytic converter. As described in the text here, it doesn't actually help with NOx directly. Compared to later three-way catalytic converters, they also have a worse effect on engine power, efficiency, and reliability. But during this time period, it's just what you're stuck with. There's also the exhaust reactor. This is only available with compact cast headers. It's worse in every way, especially reliability, where you can see just clicking on it does almost a 10-point hit. The only advantage of the exhaust reactor is that it unlocks much earlier. If you're playing on the campaign difficulty setting, where the emissions regulations come in earlier, that may be a necessary choice. However, it's a painful one, so avoid it if you can. Now, catalytic converters always require unleaded fuel, and the exhaust reactor in particular requires compact cast headers. If you're playing earlier versions of the game, this handy tooltip that tells you that isn't in yet. So keep that in mind. You won't see these options unless you switch first to unleaded, and you won't see the exhaust reactor unless you choose a compact cast header. Once emissions get involved, there's really just no continuing to use leaded fuel, and it's going to get banned entirely not much later anyways. So this is always the first thing you should do. Another important thing to keep in mind is that quality slider can help, but because of the whole engine airflow simulation and the way that emissions calculate on these maps, you can get an effect where if you increase quality in some area, the emissions actually get worse. But you also might find that if you continue to increase it, they get better again. As a rule of thumb, better quality does help, although you might need to tune around any particular quirks it causes. The next most important thing you can do is improve your fuel distribution system. We can see here that going from a 2-barrel to a 4-barrel carburetor also creates a pretty big difference. As does going to 2 carburetors. Quality in this area will again help as it makes the whole engine more efficient. However, again, in this worst case scenario of working on a truck, we will notice that reliability is a very large factor. And going to the 4-barrel carburetor causes a large hit on reliability. For a premium or luxury or sports or even family car, this might be acceptable. But for our truck, we're going to keep it simple. This is also the situation you'll find yourself in if you have no engineering time to spare and need your new emissions-ready variant out quickly. Another beneficial quick freebie option is hyper-eutectic cast pistons. There's a slight stress and durability downside over regular cast, but really they're a good decision in most cars, unless you really wanted to use forged. Hyper-eutectic just means it's aluminum with a lot of silicon content, and supposedly the way this helps in emissions is that it creates a tight seal of the cylinder walls. But I don't really need to know the metallurgy behind it. I just click this option and the emissions get better. After that, we're starting to get into the options that give our engine a bit of malaise. Some of these are going to cost us power. First things first, lowering your compression and cam profile helps a lot. This is the one that's especially a bad thing for sports cars, so you might want to get your emissions from other areas like really high-tech carburetors or other fuel systems. But for our truck, we can afford very low cams, which get us more torque at the cost of power. Depending on what exactly is going on in your emissions map, lower compression can help. The main effect you're going to notice, though, is that a higher compression potentially creates better combustion, which helps with carbon monoxide, but it tends to increase hydrocarbons and NOx. Usually, you're going to end up with a lower compression engine if you're very concerned about emissions. The next thing we can tweak is our fuel map. Going leaner does not help NOx. You'll see it gets a slightly higher number, but it helps a lot with carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons. As a rule of thumb, extremely rich or lean fuel maps are not efficient for the catalytic converter. At this point, we've got a truck that's pretty close to passing emissions. We're at WES 5, but we want to hit 6 so it can be good for a while. At this point, there's a lot of stuff we can still change on the vehicle itself. Because it's a truck, we have extremely short gearing. That results in our emissions map running the engine all the way out to the red line on the right side of the graph, which is not great for emissions or fuel efficiency. So, keeping an eye on desirability, raising our first gear, moves our areas where we spend the most time down to the left, which is better. increasing the high gear also helps. In this case, we can afford to add a fourth speed to our transmission, and increasing the top gear a lot means the engine never runs close to redline. Just those gearing changes reduced our carbon monoxide emissions by about half. However, we still need to reduce it by half again. Anything that reduces drag on the vehicle means you have to use less throttle while driving. So, just throwing a +1 aero quality saves us 100 milligrams per kilometer of carbon monoxide. Let's say we can go to afford to +2 and also reduce our cooling airflow a little bit, because we had it dragged very high to maximize that utility stat. This does cause a small hit, but I think it's affordable. That's about as far as I want to go without completely compromising the vehicle. Another important place to invest quality points is in your fuel system. This gets expensive for later fuel systems, but carburetors, which you'll have in the early game, are very cheap to invest quality in. You may consider going as high as 5 or 6 above your tech pool. Throwing an extra 3 points of quality on there saves us a lot of carbon monoxide again. Finally, we can finish reaching WES 6 by pulling out almost the last of the fuel map and cam profile. This has lost us some horsepower from when we started off, but hey, that's the Malaise era for you. Now, do you want to gain back some lost power while still meeting emissions? Forced induction is usually the answer. Even in the early game, you have access to superchargers. We can see that just throwing the supercharger on and not even tuning it, we are almost still passing emissions with our 0 cams and 0 fuel, but making much more respectable power. There's a couple reasons why this is. First of all, you can see that our area used on the graph here has gone way down to the left because we're making a lot more power. You just don't need to hit the throttle that hard during the emissions test to reach the speeds required. Incidentally, you can ignore the fact that this hydrocarbons graph, or carbon monoxide graph, is completely green. When you mouse over it, you will see that there are numbers on there, but the color gradient chosen for this graph just makes it not useful. You can still get an idea of where your worst areas are, and intuitively you're going to know they're always higher up and to the right anyway. We got our supercharged engine with a quick tune, passing emissions by shrinking the headers down to compact cast. This is actually something you will see done on real cars as well. The closer the catalytic converter is to the head, the more efficient it is because it needs to heat up. Now we're making 184 horsepower and passing emissions without a huge reliability hit or anything like that. Now for some more modern design tricks, we'll look at an 80s Fruinian commuter car. I'm the car designer again, and my year is set to 1980, although realistically in the campaign, this would be a car that's coming out around 1985 or so. We just have an engine that's a little under 1.5 liters, according to the taxes in Fruinia, and the car does well with every family and family-adjacent market. Very little power. But of course, because we haven't tuned anything yet, it's still not passing emissions. In this case, we would want to pass WES 7, because that's what's going to be not long after the car comes out in campaign. And that's going to be good for a few years. You'll probably want to facelift it. But with that design year, we don't see level 8 emissions in the interface here. I've had it set up with a 2-barrel carburetor. But a much better choice for this era would be single-point EFI. Multi-point is shown as available in this case, but that's actually using up tech pool, which you might not actually have. Every variant of EFI, whether it's single-point, multi-point, or direct injection, unlocks the lambda equals 1 area slider. This has a direct effect on our fuel map, because we now have access to an actual fuel map, instead of this map being generated by carburetor barrels opening and closing at different pressures. Simply drag it like that, and an entire area on the bottom left portion of the graph becomes exactly lambda 1 or 14.7 to 1 AFR. That means that the catalytic converter will operate most efficiently in that area. This has required no further tuning from me. We can see that the emissions in that lambda 1 area go much lower than outside of it. This gives us the best of both worlds. If we want rich or lean running in some of the parts of the graph, say to make higher power up here where it's rich, or lean to save some fuel, we can have that, while the areas where it spends most of its time idling and gently accelerating get the best emissions. Just dragging that one slider has already got us to WES 7 with no further tuning. It's worth knowing that in this case, we're also looking at a car already set up with long gearing, because that's what they want for fuel economy, and decent aerodynamics, and all those other things that save a little bit of fuel, put you in a good place for emissions. And as an added bonus, but not surprising, the fuel-injected version of this engine makes much more power than the carbureted one. If we want, we can even throw a turbocharger on there, which makes way more power. The story is similar to what we saw with supercharger on the older vehicle. It increases our carbon monoxide a little bit. If we go a little leaner, this still affects the area outside of our lambda equals 1 corner, and promptly allows us to pass emissions. We could even make an extreme emissions version of this car by dumping the cam profile and compression. We can reach the requirements for WES 8, which are not shown on the engine screen but are shown in the car detail stat screen. I'm sorry, that's WES 9. We're aiming for 7. We had already hit 8. And I can get this thing up to 9 with a turbo, making over 100 horsepower. And yes, the market's still like that too. We haven't made the car unreliable or anything. So this would be an extreme emissions car, which gets you lots of emissions tax credits by throwing that turbo in there. If we didn't have the turbo, the extremely low compression and cams that we'd need would be a big compromise on the power of the engine, but with the turbo, they are not. It's not a one-size-fits-all option. You can see the effect the turbo has on service costs, but consider it. For our last example, we're going to demonstrate how you can really take the emission system and break it over your knee. This is a rough replica of a McLaren F1, a 90s supercar making more than 600 horsepower from a naturally aspirated, high-revving V12. This is the kind of car that people say that you just can't make anymore because of emissions. Basically, every engine has to be tuned to make emissions good first and power second. So modern cars that are very powerful are almost always turbocharged, and you can't have a crazy high-revving V12 with aggressive cams like this in real life. In automation, though, we can get away with it with a little tuning. With no serious tuning done to it, the engine's good for WES 8. We put a catalytic converter on there, it's unleaded fuel, it's a modern fuel injection system with high-quality parts. As we can see, our fuel emissions map uses very little of the actual fuel map. Most of the engine's ability is not used on the emissions test. So the first thing to do is just increase that lambda 1 area to encompass the entire emissions test. Boom, good. That gets us to WES 9. But our goal is to be able to hit 11. That's the highest emissions standard in automation. Now I'm cheating a little bit. I've set the car to be newly designed in 1998, which is the year that the F1 went out of production, and it's kind of all turbo cars after that. That's why to this day, the McLaren F1 from the 90s is still the fastest naturally aspirated car ever legally sold for road use. Now the first thing we're going to do is give up a little power, because I chose a long header to get the most out of our naturally aspirated engine. We're going to go down to a mid, and that unlocks the 3-way plus pre-cat catalytic converter as a bit of an early unlock. I'll have to take quality off of that to say it's realistic to do in campaign. And oh hey, look, we're already there. I didn't have to hardly do anything. We still have a high cam profile, and we're still making a little over 600 horsepower. I thought I was going to have to use VVL, but this time I didn't even have to do that, which is kind of insane. But more realistically, we'd have a lower cam profile normally, and then a high VVL profile with some changeover. There, that's McLaren F1 power, naturally aspirated, meeting and exceeding the highest emission standard in automation by a high margin. I think that means if you were to sell this car in-game, you'd still get paid some credits back for it, even though it's not meeting a higher standard level than what's required. Needless to say, this gets even more silly if we turbocharge it. Just throwing a turbo on there with a rough tune, it makes, 1100 horsepower, and this is a car that would be on sale in, like, campaign engineering time, maybe 2005. Still, of course, we're being the highest emissions in the game. We're getting paid emissions credits to sell this car. Heck, if I go actually tune the thing a little bit, make it a twin turbo, we've got, what? Still getting paid for emissions, of course, and that's more power than the Koenigsegg 1.1, which will make it the most powerful car in the world up until 2015. And this is a 1998 design. So the fact that you can do that without even compromising on emissions is kind of crazy. As you saw in our other builds, the first thing we did to do better emissions was put a catalytic converter on the vehicle. However, there are some downsides to catalytic converters. They reduce your fuel efficiency, they reduce reliability, and they're expensive. So the first generation Honda Civic, up until about 1981, actually managed to meet regulations with no CAT by using a novel combustion chamber, and I think some other lean running cars may have as well. So this we have here is more of a replica of something like a Geo Metro, which did have a catalytic converter, but it's got a small 1-liter engine. I've got it set up here running low cams, low compression, very lean. If you use the lambda on this, because it is fuel injected, it actually gets worse, because you want that lean down low here. And I was able to hit WES 8, which means you can sell this car up until, what's that, about 1998 in Fruinia or 2001 in Gasmia. Not bad. However, I don't recommend doing this. It came in very underwhelming in terms of power. 46 horsepower from a 1-liter motor versus something like 55 from a real-life Geo Metro. Or even those 80s Honda Civics had about 65 horsepower. And the nice thing is it can run on leaded gas and still pass emissions. Not that that's a problem by the 90s. Or low quality, or whatever you want. But overall, I don't actually recommend doing this. While catalytic converters were a big problem for companies in real life, especially back in the 70s, by this time in the 90s, the only real thing it does is the $200 cost and like 1 horsepower is what you lose from that. And sure, that's 20% of the overall engine cost. It's not nothing at scale, but it's really not worthwhile compared to just tuning the engine to run a little higher and make more power. I just wanted to show that, like some cars in real life did, you can do it too in automation. Pass up to 2001-ish emissions without a cat. Now go forth, knowing that no matter what kind of car it is, you can make it pass emissions, and you can probably even get the government to give you a kickback.